Hey friends, welcome back. This is our third video where we are surveying some of the new Belief Map content, specifically on the topic of why we should think the gospel material is witness-based. And we are again going to explore one branch of evidence, and it looks exclusively at reasons to think the gospel stories formed honestly, which is of course directly opposite of there being lies or legends. And if they are honest reports about what Jesus said and did, what could they be other than witness testimony? That's our goal. That's what we're arguing for ultimately. So why should you agree that the gospel stories are honest? Well, here are 5 whole branches of evidence for that. The first branch, and we're going to spend a little time here, argues that the gospel stories are full of bits of content which we can confirm is honest. And since there's so much stuff that we can know is honest, we get to further say that whatever mechanisms were involved in the construction of the Gospels, they had a clear propensity to churn out a lot of honest content. At the same time, we don't have any clear examples of lies, unless you're just going to automatically assume the miracle stories are lies, which, we're not going to do. So, since we have lots of honest content and no clear dishonest content, we again have a hard trend like in our last video. And so, we can extrapolate from this strong trend of honesty and recognize it as evidence that the gospel stories as a whole are honest. So let's explore some internal evidence that the Gospels spew lots of honest content. For time's sake, we're going to skip the evidence from the reports being early, which means we are skipping a lot, and we're also skipping the evidence from the reports being full of liar, self-exposing content. Okay, we're going to instead go straight to this evidence, which is that the Gospel stories spew unchurchy content. And the idea here is that after Easter, Christianity took on its own personality. It developed its own quirks and preferences and ways of talking. So if the gospel content were legendary rather than true history, then historians would expect these post-Easter quirks to be retrojected onto the lips of Jesus and the apostles. But, so the argument goes, post-Easter quirks are nowhere to be found in the Gospels. So let's go deeper into the tree so we can see how to argue for this specifically. First, the language and thought of speakers in the Gospels was very pre-Christian. So for a quick, simple example, we never hear of people receiving Jesus. That was an exclusively post-Easter way of talking. And as it happens, there are at least 10 uncontroversial examples of this kind of dissimilarity. And in fact, there's a whole famous academic book which discusses how dissimilar the post-Easter church's language is from that language of Jesus and the apostles and the gospel accounts. Second, the Gospels spew quirky Jesus behavior. So in all of our sources, we see Jesus doing things that the church just didn't do. For example, we see Jesus prefacing his comments with amen. And he does it 59 times in our sources, and that's 59 times independently, which means if Matthew and Luke record the same story, we are only counting it once here. So that's a lot. By contrast, churches just never preface their comments with amen. So where did that quirk come from? Why does it exist so strongly and so evenly across our sources on the lips of Jesus? Likewise, Jesus' favorite way to refer to himself is as the Son of Man. He does this, you can see, 58 independent times, evenly across our sources. You can explore these and 9 more examples of Jesus' quirkiness if you visit this article. And then we have a third example, what I call church-hated content. Basically, by definition, church-hated content is stuff that Christians would not want to invent. So if they say it, they're only saying it out of honesty, which is, again, that's what we're driving towards. So let's go deeper again into the tree so that we can see how to argue for this. We are going to go ahead and skip over this large section on how the church spews all of this suboptimal content, and we're going to go right to this. The Gospels spew church embarrassing content. Now that is something that they hated. So some gospel content embarrassed the church because it portrayed their leading apostles in a shameful way. Likewise, the gospel content sometimes embarrassed the church because it portrayed Jesus himself in embarrassing ways. For example, we have a ton of evidence that early Christians, quite naturally, found it embarrassing that Jesus was baptized by another man, namely John the Baptist. Jesus is supposed to be his superior, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke all bite down and report it anyways. So that's just one quick example among several that you can explore. So now look where we are in the tree. You are about to see what makes belief maps so powerful to those who want to learn apologetics and those exploring these issues in general. It's going to tell us how all of this fits together. So first, if we've got all these examples of things that would have been embarrassing to Christians in the Gospels, then truly the Gospels depict Jesus embarrassingly. And if they depict Jesus embarrassingly, then of course the Gospels spew church-embarrassing content. And if the Gospels are spewing church-embarrassing content, then of course that's one kind of church-hated content. It establishes that this was being spewed out as well. And if it's spewing out church-hated content, well, that's one kind of unchurchy content, and it supports our belief in that, along with the other evidences. And if it's spewing unchurchy content, well, that goes to show that they were spewing out honest, non-legendary content. This isn't the type of stuff that the church would produce, the Christians would invent and circulate. And if the Gospels are truly spewing out all of this non-legendary and honest content, then we argued using inductive extrapolation that would give us a strong reason to think that the Gospels as a whole were formed honestly. And finally, that traces back to our case that the Gospels, in fact, are all witness-based. So we've got a really cool trail to help people remember where they are on the map and how all of this stuff fits together. Okay, so that was just a quick recap to show you the power of Belief Map, but we're in the middle of showing that the Gospels are honest. So I'm going to continue that line of thought here. We've still got 4 more branches of evidence to go. Our second branch is this. The Gospels burst with incidental assumptions and details fine-tuned to a Palestinian milieu. So in our last video, yes, we saw some stuff that was fine-tuned to a specifically AD 30 Palestinian milieu. But here, all we're asking is that it be Palestinian. And why is that evidence for honesty? Well, soon after Jesus was crucified, you may know, gospel stories circulated through the non-Palestinian regions of Egypt and Italy, the Anatolia, and so forth. So, if lies and legends were really forming in the Christian communities, then they would have been formed frequently enough in these outer regions. But if that were the case, then we would not expect to see references to like niche and esoteric features unique to Palestinian life. Because the liars obviously wouldn't know that stuff. They don't live there. And just to be clear, there were no relevant reference works that could be consulted on this kind of thing. By contrast, if the gospel stories do all originate from honest, eyewitness Palestinian reports of things that they experienced firsthand in Palestine, then it's only natural that these kind of sharp Palestinian details would show up in the Gospels. So let's dive deeper and see what I'm talking about. First, the Gospels casually reference over 50 sites local to the region, some of which are pretty obscure. Now, I haven't uploaded all of this from my notes onto Belief Map yet, but there's a lot to show here. For now, I just put down 27 cities and a footnote here. And again, a lot of these are not going to be known to anyone in Greece or Rome. These weren't like big cities. So this is all localized to Palestine. Second, the Gospels rightly disambiguate popular first names in precisely this Palestinian region. So for example, the Gospels disambiguate all 4 characters named Simon because that was literally Palestine's most popular name. So you have Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, Simon the Leper, Simon the Cyrenian. And we see this sort of pattern for all the popular names in the Gospels. They all have disambiguators. But when you have unpopular names like Philip and Thomas and Andrew, those needed no disambiguation in Palestine. And guess what? The Gospels don't record anyone using those names with a disambiguator. It's almost as if these stories naturally came right out of Palestine, like they claim, rather than out of Egypt, Greece, or any other location where Christianity became popular later. Third, the Gospels are all written in Greek, right? But scholars can tell that many of Jesus' sayings came out of his mouth in the Aramaic language. How do they know that? Well, it's not just that Aramaic was what most everyone in Palestine would have been normally speaking. It's that on occasion the gospel authors will tell us outright. For example, Mark outright records that Jesus said verbatim, Talitha cum, and then he translates it for his readers. We have 15 examples of this in the Gospels, so that's hardcore Palestinian. Fourth, we can also detect the Aramaic language in a more subtle way. So it turns out Jesus' sayings often super translate backwards from Greek into Aramaic. For example, there are puns that you can only hear in Jesus' sayings if you translate them from the Greek gospel text back into Aramaic. For example, in Aramaic, when Jesus says, "You strain out a gnat but swallow a camel," in Aramaic it sounds like this: "You strain out a galma but swallow a gamla." Okay, it's a pun. And in addition to these puns, if you translate the Greek of Jesus' sayings back into Aramaic, you're going to find that lots of these sayings actually have really neat parallelisms. They have a sort of beat and rhythm to them that was designed for helping people remember things. And there's more, which we don't have time to explore here, but we can be confident that the Gospels spew Palestinian material, just like they would if they were honest eyewitness accounts, rather than lies or legends from random Christians located all throughout the Roman Empire. Okay, so what's our next evidence that the Gospel stories are, as a whole, honest? So we covered branch 1 and branch 2. Branch 3 is that the Gospels lack anatopisms, which are sort of geographical absurdities. For example, like if the Gospels had a story of Jesus riding an elephant in Jerusalem rather than a donkey, that would be an anatopism. But we don't see any of these sorts of accidents. Branch 4 is similar. It argues that the Gospel stories lack anachronisms. So remember that the Gospels were written 4 to 6 decades after Jesus' earthly ministry ended, and life in Palestine changed over time. We saw one example in the last video with the town of Bethsaida having its name changed to Julia. In fact, we also saw how the Pharisee debate topics changed and how rhetoric changed throughout these decades as well. Like these, there are 100 little opportunities for liars decades after Jesus to slip up and write with assumptions that only fit during their time, decades after Jesus' death. But as it happens, again, the Gospels have no anachronisms that historians know of. Just as a quick contrast, the Gnostic Gospels, as an example, are short on authentic Palestinian details, and yet they've got a number of these anachronisms. So historians are used to looking for them and finding them in dishonest texts. Branch 5 is this. It's that historians know Christians were very careful, not just with the gospel stories in particular, but with Jesus' biography in general. Now, we don't have time to explore this, but in a nutshell, we know that Christians had lots of well-established reasons to be careful about what they said about Jesus. This branches off a lot. And second, in various ways, we can see the fruits of their great care in action. You can compare the synoptics, for example, and see how well they did. And third, we can see the methods that they used would have been successful. We're actually going to cover some of that in the next video. Anyways, altogether, we've got a very solid case for the gospel stories being honest. And if these stories are honest, with an honest origin, then the only explanation we saw for their existence is going to be testimony, authentic eyewitness testimony. And so this is our third big evidence and our third video for the big claim that the gospel stories as a whole are truly witness-based. I'll see you next time.